The controversy over Brexit is back. Why does the United Kingdom want to tear up parts of an international agreement with the European Union? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. When the United Kingdom negotiated its exit from the European Union, both sides hammered out a withdrawal agreement. But with just months to go before the United Kingdom ends its transition period for leaving the European Union, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson wants to override part of that agreement. He is pushing for new legislation to be approved in London that will give greater protection to the UK internal market. A cabinet minister acknowledged in the House of Commons that the move would break international law.
Yes, this does break international law in a very specific and limited way. We are taking the power to disapply the EU law concept of direct effect required by Article 4 in a certain very tightly defined circumstances. And there are clear precedents for the UK and indeed other countries needing to consider their international obligations as circumstances change.
The move has drawn strong criticism from European leaders, and even former British Prime Ministers have denounced the action. Well, we have a great panel to discuss all of this. Joining me now via Skype from London is Alexandra Phillips. She is a political commentator and a former Brexit Party member of the European Parliament. Also with us from London is Helen Thomas. She is a political analyst and the CEO of BlondeMoney. Joining us here in Washington, D.C. is Brian O'Donovan. He is Washington correspondent for the Irish broadcaster RTE News. And with us from Miami is Remi, Piet. He is a European political analyst and university professor. Thank you to all of you for being with us. Helen, let me start with you. Great to see you again. The United Kingdom signed on to this withdrawal agreement with the European Union that lays out essentially the terms of the UK's exit from the EU. But now it wants new terms which would effectively override that initial agreement. Here's Prime Minister Boris Johnson.
Mr. Speaker, we cannot have a situation where the very boundaries of our country could be dictated by a foreign power or international organisation. No British Prime Minister, no government, no Parliament could ever accept such an imposition.
So, Helen, what is the core argument that Boris Johnson is making here? He's also talking about wanting to pass something called the Internal Market Bill.
Yes, that's right. And this is where the provocation all comes from. It is about the UK Union and the internal market for the United Kingdom. And then, of course, we have the European Union single market on the other side of this. And this all becomes an issue when we look at Northern Ireland, which is kind of sitting between the two. If there is no deal agreed by the end of this year, and with the clock ticking, that are looking more likely, that is leading to Boris Johnson trying to say, look, we've got to get the UK Union sorted out. That's what matters to us. And the internal market of the United Kingdom takes precedence. So
Boris Johnson, to be clear, has agreed, or his government has agreed to something, and he now wants to withdraw from that.
That is not an entirely fair way to look at it from the government's point of view, at least. They would say, look, this problem comes to mind only in the case of we want to get a deal. And they would say, all we're trying to do is interpret whose responsibility it is if goods now need to pass from the United Kingdom into the European single market over this Irish border. The government would simply say, interpret that, which actually within the withdrawal agreement said they would give unfettered access to goods moving between Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
All right, let me bring in Alexandra Phillips. Alexandra, welcome to the show. As expected, there has been very strong opposition to this from the European Union, but even in Britain, former Prime Minister Theresa May is voicing concern. This is what she had to say.
The United Kingdom government signed the withdrawal agreement with the Northern Ireland Protocol. This Parliament voted that withdrawal agreement into UK legislation. The government is now changing the operation of that agreement. Given that, how can the government reassure future international partners that the UK can be trusted to abide by the legal obligations of the agreements it signs?
Alexandra, that's a very powerful argument there that Theresa May is making. It's about the UK government keeping its word. Doesn't this undermine the United Kingdom's reputation internationally?
Well, look, let's look at the heritage of the deal. What Boris Johnson brought back to Parliament in the midst of the constitutional crisis, the Conservatives were 11 seats in deficit of majority. We had political deadlock in the system. And what Boris saw as expediency in somehow unblocking that was bringing back Theresa May's deal. She was the author of that deal. He repackaged it with the EU in but a week. We both know that that is not enough to actually renegotiate an international treaty. He sold it to the British public as a fantastic new deal, and in doing so, he unlocked that political deadlock. It is no surprise that Theresa May should back her own deal that she authored, that Boris Johnson himself called vassalage, and say in breaking that deal, it's committing a sacrilege against international treaty. I suppose that one interpretation that is the case. But what you have to look at is what the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom is responsible for. And surely it's the integrity and the best interests of the United Kingdom. Now, one can say that Boris Johnson should not have come back with Theresa May's deal that he knew was unsatisfactory, sell it to the British public to unlock that deadlock, and then months later say, well, it was a mistake, it was a hoodwink, and now I want to resolve those issues. It does create complex problems. But on the other hand, the EU are not, they're not benign and benevolent in all of this. They knew and they conspired with opposition forces in the UK to put us into this deadlock situation. And one could say that via international law, they weren't negotiating in good faith. And on the balance of what I find preferable, should Boris Johnson enable going forward the annexation administratively of Northern Ireland at the behest of the EU and this deal that he supposedly repackaged, or should he be putting national interests first? I think the threat of the EU in suggesting they could blockade the transportation of food and goods from mainland Great Britain to Northern Ireland, two constituent parts of the same United Kingdom recognised by international law as one country, is that the way that they should be acting? Absolutely not.
Brian O'Donovan, of course, this is being watched very closely in the Republic of Ireland as well as in Northern Ireland, which is a part of the United Kingdom. Here is what the Irish Foreign Minister Simon Coveney had to say recently. Let's listen.
So I would caution anyone who is thinking about playing politics with Northern Ireland on Brexit again. Northern Ireland is too fragile and too important to be used as a pawn in the broader Brexit negotiations.
Brian, all sides have said that they do not want a re-emergence of a hard border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. They want to protect the Good Friday Agreement and, of course, the peace that came with it. Is this now all at risk?
I think there's certainly concerns in Dublin, in parts of Belfast, and here in Washington that, yes, it could be at risk, and there could be this threat of a return of a hard border. You played a clip there of Simon Coveney. We learned tonight that Simon Coveney, the Irish Foreign Minister, will be here in Washington next week for meetings with senior members of the Trump administration and senior members of Congress on Capitol Hill. Ireland has a very strong lobby here in Washington, and we've seen that play out over the last few weeks. Last week, Dominic Raab, the UK Foreign Secretary, came to Washington, and in the course of a day, he had a very mixed day. In the morning, he met with the Trump administration side, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. Remember, Donald Trump is a big fan of Brexit, he's a big fan of Boris Johnson, and he's not a big fan of the European Union. And after that meeting, Dominic Raab and Mike Pompeo came out and they spoke about how they had a very good meeting. Mike Pompeo spoke about how he trusts the UK when it comes to Northern Ireland and that he trusts the UK to do the right thing on Brexit. Dominic Raab then came out and said if there's any threat to the Good Friday Agreement and the return of a hard border, he said it's coming from the European Union side with their threats to put a border down the Irish Sea. That evening, Dominic Raab met with senior Democratic members of Congress, including the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, and Richard Neal, the chairman of the very powerful Ways and Means Committee. This is the committee that will oversee any future US-UK trade deal after Brexit. And they told him in no uncertain terms that if there is any threat to the Good Friday Agreement, then there will be no US-UK trade deal. And that is something that will be on Dominic Raab's mind and Boris Johnson's mind when it comes to this internal markets bill, this threat coming from the Democratic side. No US-UK trade deal if you threaten the return of a hard border. And as Dominic Raab is leaving Washington, there was a tweet from Joe Biden, the Democratic presidential candidate, saying the Good Friday Agreement cannot be a casualty of Brexit, and there will be no US-UK trade deal if any threat is made to the Good Friday Agreement.
Remi, Piet, of course, European Union leaders are outraged at this. Here is what the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said.
It cannot be unilaterally changed, disregarded or disapplied. This is a matter of law and trust and good faith. And that is not just me saying it. I remind you of the words of Margaret Thatcher. I quote, "Britain does not break treaties. It would be bad for Britain, bad for relations with the rest of the world, and bad for any future treaty on trade." End of quote. This was true then, and this is true today.
Remi, Piet, those are very tough words there from Ursula von der Leyen. I mean, she's even quoting Margaret Thatcher. How will this impact UK-EU relations?
Well, obviously here you have to see it in a greater context. And here von der Leyen is really talking about the importance of sustaining and continuing on the agreement because of the importance of international law. And if there's one country or throughout history that has been pushing for respecting international law, it is the UK. So that's why she's playing, the United Kingdom our own game, saying that the reputation of the UK would be on the line. Now let's look back at basis. I mean, we're having relationships between the EU and the United Kingdom, which are fairly tense right now because it's a moment of negotiation. So you have to take into the understanding of the negotiation itself. Boris Johnson tried to have another leverage into his negotiation hands, but at the end of the day, you have to look at what is possible. There's two options here. Since the UK actually wants to move away from the European Union and enforce Brexit, therefore they're not part of the single market unless they abide by a series of European regulation. And if they're not part of the single market, there needs to be a frontier, either a hard frontier, which nobody wants because it would actually reignite a very strong conflict that has been painfully settled in the Good Friday Agreement, or some kind of a custom barrier indeed in the sea between Northern Ireland and the UK, where products will actually pay taxes. Taxes will be reimbursed if they're actually used in Northern Ireland, and that will allow to prevent fostering of conflicts at the frontier between Northern Ireland and Ireland. But if you don't want to be part of the sectional union, you have to follow up with the consequences, which is reinstating a relationship between two different trade partners that have to abide by this new series of rules. And the question here from the European Union is basically to tell Boris Johnson and the administration, come back to the negotiation table, come back with realistic solutions. Do not, try to play games of internal politics, and let's find, a good agreement such as the one that has already been agreed and implement it and see how we work together into the future relationship between the European Union and the UK.
Alexandra Phillips, listening initially there to what Remi Piet had to say, I mean, there are two ways of looking at this. One is the domestic political situation in the United Kingdom, which you've explained very well to us. But there is the other, which is respecting international laws. It's something that the international system depends on.
Yeah, absolutely. But listen, I mean, I think it was actually quite crass that von der Leyen quoted Thatcher. I think Thatcher would turn in her grave at the idea that the United Kingdom itself could be mortgaged off the back of EU international geopolitical bullying. And that's what we need to regard this as. The people who set up this conflated problem with the Good Friday Agreement and a hard border in Northern Ireland, between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, was the EU. They've weaponized the Good Friday Agreement. And what will precipitate if what ends up as the result of these negotiations is Northern Ireland is administratively annexed to the EU, which is what they want as their payment for us having the audacity to be self-governing. That is what they consider to be the mortgageable elements that we must give up. In doing so, what they will precipitate is a reignition of the Troubles, because you're going to end up with a principle of non-consent, which is a fundamental principle of the Good Friday Agreement, and Northern Ireland, without any vote of the people in Northern Ireland, suddenly being in a position where it is no longer really part of the EU, the UK, only in name only, and is administered entirely by a foreign entity. And this is part of the United Kingdom. And frankly, I'm surprised that there's not been more consternation from the international community that you've got a geopolitical bloc saying to a member that is democratically decided to leave and go its own way, actually, we want to govern you via the back door through the element of Northern Ireland and this very fragile peace agreement, and we're going to exploit that to get our own way. And it surprises me, shocks me, and upsets me that the international community aren't reading this situation. And what I found as an MEP Christmas, I went over to America to talk to fellows in Congress, Senate about this issue. And what I discovered was, in the absence of an ambassador to the United States, which in that position, Sir Kim Darroch was no longer in that seat, what I found was an entirely rigorous and robust lobbying system from the EU and Ireland straight into the American administration. And right now in the US, you've got election time. And the Democrats are very, very concerned about securing the Irish vote. And this has happened in previous election times with the O-Obama, you know, his long lost roots to Monegal. It happens every American election time. And in order to secure those Irish votes, the Irish American votes, I believe that the Ireland and the EU itself is lobbying for them to push on this. And so it doesn't surprise me that it's reared its ugly head yet again. But it's warmongering. Essentially, it's using a fragile peace agreement. This is, in modern historical terms, very new, and using that to try and browbeat the UK into submission. And I am absolutely outraged that the international community don't recognise that.
Okay, Brian, what are your thoughts on what you've just heard?
Well, I think the whole concept of the EU using this to browbeat the UK is an interesting one, because I suppose they would come back with the argument of, you signed a deal, you signed an agreement, the Brexit withdrawal agreement in January. We thought this was done and dusted, and that's the reaction I get here in the US when you speak to Irish officials and when you speak to US officials. I remember Nancy Pelosi speaking to her on Capitol Hill last week, and she spoke about how her phone just started hopping in the middle of the night when this news broke that Boris Johnson was introducing this internal markets bill, and there was a real sense here, certainly in Washington, that we thought this was done and dusted. And when Dominic Raab came over last week and gave these assurances of no return to a hard border, if there's any threat to the Good Friday Agreement, it's coming from the EU side, nothing to see here, everything's fine, there was a sense of, well, you gave us these assurances 9 months ago when this bill was signed, and we don't know why we are back here. I think here in the US there's a big confusion as to why we're going down this route again. To pick up on a point that a previous contributor made as well, maybe it is just all hardball from Boris Johnson. Maybe it is just a case of, let's throw this internal markets bill on the table right now because we're in the middle of a negotiation. Let's get some leverage out of this. But it's certainly caused a lot of consternation in Ireland and here in the US.
What do you think, Helen? Is this part of a negotiating tactic on the part of Boris Johnson?
Absolutely, yes. And, you know, let's not forget politics is always at play here, and there is a campaign to be won. We saw some pretty extreme tactics a year ago, where there was the proroguing of Parliament, where the campaign was set up as the people versus Parliament, which in the end put Boris Johnson back in, well, put him into number 10 with a huge majority. And it seems this time around, it's being set up as the UK versus the EU. And, you know, the EU is the aggressor. And we've heard those arguments there from another contributor about how it can be seen that way. So there's clearly a political campaign going on. Any kind of deal, we all know that negotiations, everybody wants to be a winner, but the best negotiations, everybody feels a loser. So there need to be political wins out of this. And to do that, you need to ramp up the provocation to get that.
Helen, one other thing, both the United Kingdom and the European Union are trying to hammer out a trade deal. What is the status of those negotiations right now?
Well, I think it's good to see that both sides are still talking to one another, despite some of the howls of outrage that we're hearing from all sides, you know, including the US. So both sides are still talking. Progress has been made. You're starting to hear slightly better comments, both from Michel Barnier and from David Frost, the UK negotiator. That it's, you know, given particularly the world in which we now live, neither side would really want to countenance the economic dislocation from a hard exit. So there is still momentum on both sides to get something done. Clock is ticking. Our view has always been it's much more likely something will be agreed than not, but a full trade deal looks rather unlikely in the time that they've got.
Remi, Piet, do you think these are smart negotiating tactics by Boris Johnson? And given the amount of trade between the European Union and the United Kingdom, is it inevitable that they will move past these differences and there will be some stability ahead?
Well, it's part of the negotiation tricks, and it's not a surprise that Boris Johnson would actually use another, tactic to try to have, more power in the negotiation. And it's completely legitimate, to be honest. I mean, it was short-lived. It was met by the European Union by, answers of let's stop playing games and let's be serious about those negotiations. Now we're seeing a completely different climate, which is, negotiators that seems to be all looking at some kind of an agreement after the current round of negotiations. But again, the margins are limited. First of all, there was a signed agreement, so that has to be the template on which you work from. And then also the whole question of Northern Ireland and the issue that one of my esteemed co-panelists mentioned of having control over the territory of the United Kingdom. That's not exactly the case. The issue here is to understand that there's a single market, including all European countries, that has a series of rules such as higher environmental standards, higher social standards, and it is more expensive for the products to be there. What the European Union tries to avoid is to have social dumping from the UK, using Northern Ireland as a way to channel products that might be imported from other trade partners. Sometimes it could be the chicken made with bleach out of the US, for example. And if there's no borders, whether a hard border at the Northern Ireland and Ireland frontier or a check at the sea level, then you actually let the entrance of a series of products that do not abide by the sets of rules that are unfair competition to the European producers and are not as good for the consumption of the European citizen. And that's not what the European Union stands for. It cannot afford to let a gate open in Northern Ireland, and the position that Boris Johnson has is actually a fairly weak one, because the European Union has been very allied and all together in those negotiations from Ireland to Eastern European countries, trying to find a united bloc in front of Boris Johnson.
All right, I'm going to move on to some of the consequences of Brexit, which we are beginning to see. Alexandra, Bloomberg News reported this week that JP Morgan is moving about $230 billion worth of assets from the United Kingdom to Germany. In hindsight, is the economic damage caused by Brexit, or that Brexit will cause in the UK, still worth it?
Is economics an art form, or is it a science? Nobody knows. It's a game of predictions, and there are many upsides to Brexit. If you look at the need to be resilient and fleet of foot in the post-pandemic economic crisis, and with the weight of sterling on our side, our own independent currency, then actually I think it's better that we have bespoke international deals that work in favour of our national markets. And yes, there might be some initial upset as a result of the government. And look, I'm not exonerating Boris Johnson for choosing cheap political expediency and getting us into this mess. He has. He was the one who nominated this deal, told us it was brilliant, put it with an 80-strong majority in front of Parliament, and made sure it was seen through. And I think that was a catastrophic error. I mean, I'm not a Conservative Party MEP. I was a Brexit Party MEP. But at the same time, I do think that there's a huge economic uptick to being able to say, this is what we need to recover personally. This is the landscape of our marketplace. This is the landscape of our exports. These are our closest trading partners. And having the independence and sovereignty to make decisions that are best for Britain could only be a good thing economically in the wake of the fallout that's going to precipitate from pandemic policy making.
Brian, something else that's being talked about, some are talking about the prospect of a united Ireland if Brexit does serious damage on the island of Ireland, or if there is a return to violence. Could that happen?
The whole concept of united Ireland, I think, is way off in the future. It gets talked about all the time. From certain quarters, you hear very different views in Ireland, some very much in favour, some against, some expressing concerns from an economic perspective, a sort of East Germany, West Germany, who's going to pay the bills type scenario. Others, of course, this is their raison d'etre. Parties like Sinn Féin, they want to see united Ireland. It's not a clear-cut issue in Ireland. And I think right now, with the whole Brexit debate, it's one that's very much seen in the distance. We need to get over this current hurdle of internal markets. Then you're going to get back to your negotiating table on a trade deal, and then we're going to see what form Brexit really takes come January of next year. There's an interesting dynamic that we need to watch out for as well in the very short term over the coming days. I mentioned at the top that the Irish Foreign Minister, Simon Coveney, would be travelling here to Washington next week. While he is travelling here to Washington, Donald Trump's special envoy to Northern Ireland, his former Chief of Staff, Mick Mulvaney, will be travelling from here over to Ireland for his first visit. He was appointed back in March, but he wasn't able to travel because of the coronavirus. Next week, he will be arriving in Ireland with meetings in Dublin, Belfast and London, and you can be sure that Brexit, trade deals, internal market bill and this whole row will dominate proceedings when he arrives in the coming days.
Remi, Piet, does the European Union have to do a better job in its relationship with the United Kingdom post-Brexit? And I'm thinking not only of just the economy and the trade relationship, but also things like security.
No, absolutely. I mean, the UK will nevertheless remain a very important partner for the European Union, despite its decision to leave the European Union. There are some very strong relationship and collaboration on the security level, on the defense level, on intelligence also. There's obviously going to be a lot of collaboration on education purposes, on the economic front, obviously. But it's very important for the EU and the UK to continue working on issues of common interests. Yeah. There's issues on climate change mitigation, or on sustainable development goals, on negotiation internationally. They still have a common voice between the UK, France and Germany on the Iranian nuclear deal, for example. So that doesn't mean that it will not be any collaboration on the political and security front. Sadly, on the economic level, we're going to see a breakup of trade between the countries and a decrease of revenues.
Helen, I've only got a minute left, but what about Scotland? How is this being seen in Scotland, this latest controversy? And could it perhaps trigger another push for independence?
Well, with the strength of the Scottish National Party in Scotland, that is always on the agenda. And in fact, with coronavirus, we're seeing even more because Scotland is taking some of its own decisions on the response to the pandemic. I know we haven't got much time left, so I think I'll just conclude by saying, yes, Scotland will continue to agitate for independence, but the polling shows that for now, a bit like the question on United Ireland, the voters would like to leave it a little bit before they actually think on what that might mean.
Yeah, sorry about that, but we have run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us. And we need to leave it there. Thanks for joining us on another edition of The Heat.